So, traditional Jewish, Christian, or Muslim. To understand.
Atheist and agnostic as well as...
Hi, Katie.
Hi, Preston.
How are you doing?
I'm ready for this episode.
Right? This is going to be a little contentious.
I think so.
Not between us,
no.
but our parishioners might feel like they can disagree with us a lot more than they have in the past.
Well, that's what we want, isn't it?
If we can start a conversation, that's great.
This is very much a op-ed, as I called it an hour or so ago of an episode. We're going to talk about whether religion should be in schools. Welcome to the Holy Watermelon Podcast.
The idea of
that was a dramatic.
It was pretty good. I like that. Having religion in schools is a tricky thing, and it's different than teaching about religion in schools, that's for sure.
Yes, and that's sort of what we have to be very clear about. And I saw one, I guess, position that said religion should be taught in schools, but faith should not be taught in schools. And
I like it.
That's a pretty good for, I think, our Preston and I agree. So yeah, if you disagree with us, drop us a line on Discord. But I think that's a pretty good summary of our opinion on it, is that religion absolutely should be taught in schools. And we'll run through what both Preston and I think that should look like. But you can't teach faith.
Right.
Or belief or...
In America, there's a really, well, it's not really strict, but it's strict. There's laws in the Constitution, in the First Amendment to the National Constitution, preventing favoritism to any religion. But we don't really have those same privileges in Canada in the same format.
Which is funny because I feel, and this obviously, I've never been to school in America. This is all just from observation. I feel like we're less likely to break those rules. Not that we don't get me wrong, but just from... on our Discord even posting some articles and news articles that have come up out of the States.
We've had some pretty good discussions on Discord.
But where religion creeps back into schools, or people want to bring it back, or what have you. And you don't get those same news articles here as often.
Not so much, no.
Again, I'm not saying it doesn't happen. And we're in actually an interesting situation as being in Alberta, where they wanted to add religion to the curriculum, and it was terrible. They're doing it terribly. But we'll get into all that.
Yeah,
I don't want to digress too much until we have a foundation.
The devil is in the details there, that's for sure.
Ha, devil, I get it. It's funny.
What I think is really interesting is even in America, where there is a strict disestablishment preventing favoritism of any religion in any government body or branch or employee thing, like the schools.
Public.
If it's meant for public service, it's not meant to favor any religion. But that tends to not work out so great. Of course, there used to be 10 of the original colonies actually did have state religions before they did this disestablishment nonsense. And it's interesting that there still is favoritism for religions. Obviously, most of the nation, the United States, is very interested in preserving a Christian identity, especially starting with the height of the Cold War. They started adding more overtly Christian ideas into government-related things. In 1954, they added one nation under God to the Pledge of Allegiance. They have "In God We Trust" on their money. And that has nothing to do with the need to be specifically Christian, but it's also super obvious if you look around studying religious traditions. Christians are the only ones who pretend God is actually the divine name. And of course, all of that had way more to do with fighting the godless communists.
Well, and even just regular religious discrimination throughout the States and Canada as well. We don't have "In God We Trust" on our money. We got Liz on our money.
We actually do have a little parallel to "In God We Trust" on Canadian money. on most of our coinage, you'll see DG Regina on our coins, not so much on our bills. And that stands for De Gracia Regina, by the grace of God, our Queen.
Oh.
Yeah. And so they'll...
even if you extrapolate, we have Liz on our money while she's the head of the Anglican Church, so...
Right. So while we don't have an established state religion like many nations do, we still have God on our money here. With a religious figurehead on the coin.
Interesting. Yeah, I guess I've never thought of it. Just, I've personified. Clearly, I call her Liz. Queen Elizabeth. I'm her buddy. That I don't even... it's easy to forget that. You're right. She is a religious figurehead.
Mm-hmm.
Look at that.
Learning new things all the time,
So how do we want to do this? Do we want to go through some of the debate points and then talk about how we would see religious studies in schools? You have a few more talking points? You want to get
I want to start with a thing that I've mentioned before, and I want to explain it one more time for our audience. And I've had to explain it for my family on more than one occasion. When I started university, I said, I'm going in for religious studies. And everyone's like, well, are you going to start a church or something along those lines?
I just need to jump in too, because I didn't do nearly as much religious studies as Preston, but I took religious studies in school and everyone went, but you're an atheist. Sorry, continue. But
and they don't understand the appeal.
Yeah.
So there's the idea, the field of religious studies it's an anthropological, sociological field.
I was going to say, it's just hyper-specific sociology.
Right. It's the study of behaviors and beliefs that religious people are seen involved with. And it's wildly different from theology, which I also did study in university. But so theology is the study of God or gods, or the supernatural, even, is broadly speaking, sometimes kind of fits in there sometimes.
It's very, is it fair to say it's very much a doctrinal study?
I've gotten after people for the misuse of the word doctrine.
Okay, he's going to
If anything is ever taught by anybody, it is doctrine. But theology is definitely hyper-focused on the doctrines of a faith. And
I guess it comes from a place of belief. Not that I couldn't take a theology class, but it wouldn't make sense for me to go to a theological college to become a pastor.
Right.
I don't believe it.
Right. Whereas religious studies is studying people and groups of people and the things that they do that may or may not be because of the theology they subscribe to.
Yes. So this is a religious studies podcast.
Occasionally I'll get a little theological, but we're sticking mostly to religious studies of people and the things that they do because of their beliefs.
I mean, clearly we're biased, but we both think religious studies should be taught in school. And that's why we're going to go into some of these debating points that we found online. And we'll talk about both sides, but so you'll get our bias in this for sure. I'm not going to pretend like we're not in favor of it.
Yeah, as somebody who's, actively engaged in teaching our congregants about religious studies, the only argument that I could think of that sounded like it made any sense was, if everybody learns about religions in school and it's mandatory, then they won't have use for the holy watermelon. But I feel like most people don't pay attention to everything they're supposed to be learning in school anyway. So there's still a need for us
on school topics.
Right?
And how much fun would it be to study for school by listening to the Holy Watermelon podcast?
Right.
I mean, I listened to a learning Portuguese podcast, and you can take Portuguese in school. So
yeah,
it's great.
So I did have to go looking for things that people would actually want to complain about this idea of teaching religious studies in school for, because from my own thoughts, I couldn't think of anything that didn't sound like a straw man that was just useless and stupid talking heads nonsense. But we found some ideas.
I was going to say, should we pull up the negative side?
Yeah, let's bring up those. I found 2 arguments against that don't sound awful, but I don't love them either. So one of the things that sounds like it's not crazy nonsense is the argument that the appearance of state sponsorship or establishment of those religions is really a turnoff. That if somebody's going to be teaching about Islam and Christianity and Judaism in schools, and those are going to look like they're favored, and a lot of others are going to be glossed over, because realistically speaking, there's so many different religious traditions. You're not going to learn about all of them at any 1 year of social studies.
No, but and this is where we'll get into how I think a good religious studies in the public school system model will look. I just feel like my big counterpoint that I'm going to bring up frequently is, and I guess, religious studies is so vast, but, and again, I can only speak from a Canadian school system perspective, but, we, off the top of my head, throughout my 12 years of public school, we did Greece, we did China, we did Japan, we did Russia.
And how often did you talk about the influence of religion on those nations? Well,
we didn't talk about them at all, but you could argue, well, there's 200 countries in the world and you've only picked 4.
Right.
And especially now, curriculums don't change very often, which is unfortunate, but in thinking about diversity, right? Nobody in North America learns anything about Africa.
It's true.
Right? And Ethiopia was one of the founding world nations, right up there with the Ottoman Empire. And we don't learn anything about it, right? So why don't we pick Ethiopia? Why don't we pick, obviously we learn about Germany because of World War I and II. Why don't we learn about Australia as a strange little island colony? Why don't we learn about Central America or South America? You can argue that for a lot of topics. So right. Just to say, well, you can't do them all. Well, yeah, no, you can't. We can't go over every war in 12 years of public school and younger grades. It's inappropriate to go over some of the wars.
Absolutely.
I think that's just a cop-out.
Yeah.
Because school is meant to get you learning how to learn and just interest, and I don't want to say interest, exposed to enough topics that you can make a somewhat, and I still don't think even it's that great, but a somewhat informed decision on what you want to do after school. So including religious studies in that, I think, is beneficial.
It took me ages to decide I was going to go to university for religious studies after I finished high school.
And I think I wish it was included. Preston, you can speak to this. I don't think there are a lot of religious studies jobs.
No, not a lot.
Not until you get your doctorate and become a scholar, or start working in a theological position. So to be able to pursue, and that's, not to get all sentimental, but why I'm excited about Holy Watermelon is that I can actually pursue something that I'm interested in. Because I did. If I switched post-secondary schools, I'm not going to get into my history, but I would have minored. I would have minored in religious studies if I could have. But anyway, I feel like that was a big digression. I'm so sorry.
Another complaint that people have, an argument against teaching religion or religious ideas in school, is the perception that there's a need to conform for fear of exclusion, that a lot of kids are going to feel pressure. And if you pay attention to kids in the school ground, that's happening without religious education.
And I think, again, I disagree with that point because, and you're right, the exclusion is already happening and now people don't understand why.
Exactly.
So I think of 2 examples in particular. and again, this is partially where I grew up, but Muslims and Christmas concerts as a kid. Now they call them winter concerts, which is better. But the Muslim kids would always sit out and nobody really understood why, because we were 10 and we had no concept of it. And even me, not believing in a Christian God, whatever, like we still celebrate Christmas, and Santa came and Santa still shows up with presents. So it wasn't so exclusatory for me, but nobody understood why. These handful of the teachers obviously did, but the other kids didn't. And then even older, social dance. The dreaded social dance in high school, where you learn like to waltz and two-step. And same thing, the Muslim kids sit out because you're not supposed to, in their religion, touch people of the opposite gender. And I mean, I had a better grasp, obviously, by high school, but, just in feedback and doing this podcast, not everybody does understand why, that it's a different religion and this is their beliefs. So they're being excluded and no one knows why, which I think is worse than having that conversation about what they believe and finding other better or different ways to include them than as the school or the teacher or the authority figure. There's other ways. When you address why they're separate, now you can find ways to include them instead of just being like, oh, we don't talk about it.
Right.
I think is the better solution.
Yeah. And it's not like these kids aren't learning about different faith ideas at young ages. They're exposed to Sunday school as soon as their parents send them off, usually at a pretty young age, or the equivalent of Sunday school, depending on what your group is. There's theological education for children. So the idea of them being exposed to these are some of the other ideas that some of your peers have shouldn't be that hard for them to grasp.
And I mean, I remember as early as elementary, Christian friends inviting me to Sunday school, like already starting to evangelize.
Right.
Which impressive and a little concerning. But, I remember having conversations about God as early as, I'd probably say 8. And I didn't grow up in a religious household, so it was coming from friends. One of my best friends growing up was a pastor's kid, which I talked about extensively on Discord about the first time I learned about the crucifixion, how I didn't sleep for an entire night. But, we were we worry about sex, drugs, and rock and roll, but kids are also getting...
There's all kinds of peer pressure.
All kinds of peer pressure and information. So again, to not have teachers come out with facts or parents to be concerned, to not have those conversations with kids. And like, I was so lucky, like my dad is the reason I'm even into this and doing the podcast, right? Because we would just always have those conversations. And then I was 11 when 9/11 happened. So, yeah, to hide kids from this doesn't make any sense because it's happening constantly.
It's, the first complaint that did actually come to my mind as a complaint that sounds like just, it can't possibly be a legitimate concern, but it straight up is a primary concern for a lot of people. And I don't feel it, but I recognize it, is the concern of, if you expose these kids to faiths other than their own, well, they'll just stop believing what we're teaching them at home. And if that's going to happen, that's going to happen.
Yes. And
is that really the worst thing?
And this comes back to, I don't know how often I've talked about my ice cream analogy. I think I've talked about my ice cream analogy once on the podcast. And this is where I get really excited about religious studies, is that I ask you, Preston, Preston doesn't count because he was religious, but I asked Preston what his favorite ice cream flavor is, and he says chocolate. And I go, well, what about strawberry? He goes, well, I've never tried it. So, well, how do you know chocolate's your favorite if you've never tried strawberry?
Black cherry all the way.
Okay. But have you tried other flavors? And so that's always been, I feel like pet peeve is almost too strong a word because it's what, as a parent, it's what you believe is right for your family. But I don't think, if you want to compare with political spectrum, if you go, well, what do you think? Capitalism's the best. Well, do you know about or North Korea? Would you like the sounds of democracy? Oh, you don't even know what democracy is? You can't make an informed decision.
Mm-hmm.
And religion, period, affects so much of how you live your life and make your decisions that I think it's unfair to not have some exposure to other religions. And if you're worried your kids are going to convert, then maybe your beliefs aren't that good. Mic drop. I'm not dropping the mic, Brian. It's fine. Still in stand. Mic drop.
Yeah, we talked about the nature of belief before, and if you believe a thing, then hearing where other people are coming from isn't going to mess with that. And if you don't believe a thing, then maybe you'll hear something that does resonate.
Yeah. Why struggle with your belief when there might be something that solves that, right? To have some sort of existential crisis because your religion doesn't fit and there's hundreds to pick from. That's
right.
Not even, don't waste your time. Your life's too short for that.
Right. Imagine being a parent to a kid that just doesn't believe what you're trying to force onto them for years and years. And that's why they're a crappy kid. And then somehow they get exposed to a thing that they can latch on to that does make them not a crappy kid.
Well, I mean, we're going to talk about religious trauma in another episode. But that's essentially, what
so
we're talking about.
There can be some serious advantages to teaching about what religions believe and what they do because of their beliefs in school.
And again, this is not a faith-based education. This is Muslims don't eat pork. They pray to the Abrahamic God. Muhammad was the prophet. Like, that's what they're teaching, not you need to pray 5 times a day in this fashion.
Right.
That's what religious studies is.
And these kids are already in diverse communities in most cases. I've been to small towns where there's still diversity of religion.
If they're not in diverse communities, they need it even more.
Absolutely, because they're going to leave their town at some point and they'll be in for a serious shock.
Or, I mean, again, just spend 15 minutes on Facebook.
Right.
Where, again, I mentioned this, I think, in our Islam episode where someone said, well, I disagree with it. I don't know what Islam is, but I disagree with it. It's like, that's not a fair position to hold.
That's ignorant by any definition.
Yes. So you might not disagree with it. And again, this comes back to my very silly ice cream analogy, but you might not dislike it. You've just never tried it.
Right.
Like Katie and sushi for far too long of my life.
It's raw fish. Why would I eat that?
Absolutely. I was like, ew. I'm not eating raw fish. And now I regret the first 18 years of my life. So,
those are strong words.
I stand by them. Have you eaten sushi?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've had some great sushi. I've had some bad sushi.
I have a little. It's raw fish after all.
There's loads of space where you can go wrong with sushi,
Absolutely.
but there's some great sushi out there. Being exposed to ideas that are not part of your own religious tradition are also really helpful for challenging misconceptions and prejudices and straight up reduce ignorance. These are huge, important things.
Yep.
Everybody wants their kids to be good neighbors. And then so many people fight the idea that they should learn anything about their neighbors. I just don't get it.
Well, and I remember someone saying years ago, it's hard to hate someone whose story you know.
Right. I like that.
Right.
That's a good phrase.
Powerful statement.
Mm-hmm.
And right, that's exactly what this is. And anytime, I mean, being in North America, Muslims get a lot of flack and
But from ignorant people.
Absolutely. And that's what I'm saying. Like, you just ask them for a recipe. Oh, you're in. I hate
it's amazing the friendships you can make over food.
Right? And every Muslim person I've met is so hospitable. They will give you that recipe and you'll learn some great stuff along the way. So
I have some regrets. I've got a friend of mine. I haven't seen a lot of him lately, of course, because yay, world events. But a super cool guy. He's a professional chef.
Ooh.
Yeah. He's done some cooking in some fantastic places I just hope to travel to someday.
Tell me more.
At another time. But he's asked me for recipes because of my studies. He's specifically looking for old-timey home style cooking recipes from the Middle East. Now, this gentleman is ethnically from the Middle East, but he's asking me to help him in this research. And super cool, builds our friendship a little bit. I still haven't found anything that he doesn't already know, but it's a pretty cool way to build a relationship.
One of the other, it's actually funny. There's two four arguments that I found that I actually kind of disagree with.
Sure, go for it.
One is that it's a positive topic.
It's tricky, that's for sure.
and we did find the rebuttal on that, it being a negative topic. And then the other one is that it teaches ethical values. I'll start with the positive topic. So again, this was for teaching religious studies in school. So one, I'd argue that it's not a particular positive topic. And then B, I'd say, why does it matter? Because we learn about a whole bunch of horrible stuff in school. So that's where I'd start. Honestly, it doesn't matter if it's a positive topic or not, because you learn about World War II, you learn about the Russian Revolution, French Revolution. I mean, obviously, some of this is geographical. If you're American, you learn about the Civil War, Revolutionary War, and you learn a whole bunch of terrible stuff. Vietnam, we learned about. This is all social studies. Math, horrible. But I mean, we read Death of a Salesman and Hamlet and Macbeth and just
To Kill a Mockingbird.
I mean, it kind of ends happy.
But it makes people uncomfortable.
Yeah, that's true.
Which is the point of the book. And there's a good reason that every 15-year-old kid should have read this book.
I literally just read it for the first time in my life, like maybe 2 months ago.
Really?
I loved it. It was great.
Yeah, it was part of my grade 10 curriculum, I think. It might have been grade 9, but I think it was 10. And, I mean, I liked the book.
I thought it was phenomenal.
There's parts of it that are hard to read and hard to accept as a 15-year-old kid, but it's also really important lessons.
Absolutely. So that's where I say this, even as an argument, isn't really a great argument. And then so the positivity aspect is that we've covered a lot of horrible stuff in religion, period. So every religion has a sullied past. Yeah. And their religious books say not great things, any of them. And yeah, there's usually a lot of murder.
Yeah, you're coming up in your readings to a great Murder with a Railroad Spike.
Oh, exciting. Well, and I finished Deuteronomy, so you have to marry your rapist.
You don't have to marry your rapist.
I strongly recommend it. So
I do want to dive into this a little bit, and it fits into religious education. But there's a lot of laws in the Torah,
4 hours,
the Hebrew Bible, and they're not all old laws. Well, I mean, by this point they're old, but they're not all taught by Moses laws. A lot of the material is newer developments as the legal code need to develop as the nation develops.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You can tell that.
Yeah.
They're modern air quotes laws for the time.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But the specific bit about marry your rapist, a lot of people quote this as the worst possible thing for feminism. And it's not meant to be an every case sort of thing. It's an issue of there was a cultural problem among these people where, you didn't want to marry somebody who wasn't a virgin.
Right. Yeah.
And
they
so
do lead into that.
Yeah. And so a woman who is raped would have the option to force her rapist to marry her so that he would be forced to support her. They would certainly not cohabitate in most situations.
Interesting.
It's a punishment for the rapist, not the victim. And she can ask for a bill of divorce if she were to find somebody who was okay with not marrying a virgin later on.
Good. I hope she's happy.
I mean, we're talking about a theoretical person here, but
I mean,
it was definitely some real people in history too.
Anyway, so whether it's positive or not, as part of this conversation, I think the education still needs to happen.
Absolutely.
And then the point on teaches ethical values. Well, fun fact, that's a whole episode that's coming in 2 weeks.
Yeah, that's a really loaded, full of baggage set of words there.
I think if they mean in the terms that you said and other points is that it makes you a more understanding person, and it helps get rid of prejudices, and that's ethical, cool. But to say that the religions themselves have ethical values you need to learn within them,
then you've started teaching theology.
Well, it gets pretty muddy because
a little bit.
Again, no holy book is purely good, right? There's a lot of garbage, and I mean garbage as in not nice things.
I was talking to somebody a little while ago who genuinely believed that the story of Lot and his daughters was meant to be a story of a role model that you're supposed to look up to him and behave like this.
I mean, Lot didn't do anything.
Well, he had sex with his daughters.
They
raped him. They raped him while he was drunk.
Do not victim blame.
But that whole story, this guy believed that this was meant to be a role model story, which, I mean, there's a lot of terrible things in the Bible. Not all of them are role model stories.
Yeah, so if it's, the golden rule, which again shows up in most religious books in some wording or another, cool. But to say that, yeah, it starts to muddy with what is morals and ethics. And
tricky stuff.
And then you can get into that gray area of theology as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's probably some really good conversations and debates students can have about some of the content. But to say, here's this passage and it's ethical, would be a bad teacher. I think you could have a debate and say, do you think this statement is ethical, and divide the room?
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think a teacher pulling some scripture or doctrine and saying, this is ethical. I don't think that's ethical. Ha!
I like it.
Thanks.
It's such a heavy topic that we've selected for this week. But religion is always in the classroom. Until you have a classroom where nobody believes in any gods or any supernatural power, religion is in the classroom because it's part of your identity if it's something that you believe, which means it's going to come up in discussions. Somebody's going to have questions. And realistically, among teenagers, there's definitely plenty of prejudice. And teachers are going to have to address that.
Well, and I'm even thinking, I remember one social studies class I had with the most awesome teacher. She was awesome. And it was political points. It was the one I remember in particular was, should gay marriage be legal? Because it wasn't yet.
It's a hell of a discussion for a classroom.
She was my word of the week is bitch, and she was a bitch teacher. And I remember because for me, I absolutely think it should be legal. And I was so worried because I was
Can I get you to say that one more time and enunciate very carefully?
I absolutely think it should be legal.
Okay.
What did you?
I just felt like your words were a little soft.
I got too excited. I absolutely think gay marriage should be legal. And I remember I must have been 17. I was like, oh man, I just was so worried that the whole class, she actually made us physically get up and move. Yes or no.
Oh, split the room physically.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I was like so scared that I would be the only one on the yes side. I was like, no, I need to be on the yes side. And there was, in a class of 30, there was only 3 people on the no side. And then 2 of the 3 were definitely devoutly religious.
Of course.
And then one, honestly, I think was just toxic masculinity. And I honestly don't remember any of the other questions. And the room split more evenly after, besides that question. Mm-hmm. But, right, that's a political question with religious influence. Like, that's the reason 2/3 of the no's were on the no side. Mm-hmm. So to say, it's not in the classroom is impossible. And then, bigger scale, adult scale, it affects your day-to-day life. And that's political decision-making. And how can you live in a secular society? And, fair enough, you can't. I understand that as a believer, it would be hard to be like, what's best for everyone for some people. So absolutely, your religious beliefs end up in your political voting, which affects everyone. Mm-hmm. So to have an outside perspective to go, no, I don't believe in abortion, but why do other people believe in? Or I shouldn't say.
I love that wording.
I don't believe in abortion. I don't support abortion.
Those are 2 very different things.
I don't believe in abortion. Sorry, I don't support abortion. But why might I want to, give that access to someone else?
Which, like, that's an awful lot of people voted for Trump or literally any Republican candidate in any jurisdiction, or even just conservative leaning, whatever the title is, because they don't think that abortion should be legal. But specifically, super visible in American politics, a lot of people hate anybody who identifies or announces that they vote in the liberal direction because they see them as nothing more than child murderers, which is terribly ignorant.
Yeah, so even that is where I would say having a religious education is important, to realize that not everyone's religious. And then some of this stuff, and this was covered on another podcast, Behind the Bastards covered it, but fabulous podcast. Check it out if I remember to put a link in the description to the episode. But the anti-abortion movement wasn't always there.
No, it's kind of a new thing.
It's like from the 50s.
There's nothing in the Bible that explicitly, specifically forbids abortion. And
it comes, and I should, if you're listening to this and I haven't put in the show notes, send me a message. But it's rooted in racism. Is when they couldn't segregate, they shut down abortions, because if you're a single Black woman with a child, you now can't afford upward mobility. Mm-hmm. So when you couldn't separate them from your public life, you could
stratify them economically.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that's where modern day anti-abortion laws even come from. So to know that, to be taught in a history class alongside religious studies, I think is important in the world we're heading into.
Absolutely. So. People do terrible things to each other all the time. Our history is full of it. And an awful lot of that list of horrible things is religiously motivated. Leaving religion out of social studies doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, and then the interesting is, and we've had this conversation before, is things are on the surface religiously motivated. And I've had this conversation where
that's how they defend it to themselves.
Absolutely. Because what book was it that I read? I think it was, I forget. It's called like Is Religion Evil or Is Religion Bad? Very literal title. And it was defending religion. So it was actually quite contrary to my personal beliefs. And I said, but I still think religion is bad because it exacerbates what's existing. And you and I ran through, I don't know if you remember this conversation, you and I ran through a whole bunch of world events that was like, well, this was made worse by religion. You're like, but here's the political, socioeconomic stuff behind it. And while I don't disagree with you, I still think religion exacerbates it. But again, to be able to unmask that, right? To be able to look at a situation like Northern Ireland, Catholics versus Protestants, and to go, these are basically the same religion.
Pretty close.
And then B, so we look at it as a religious war, but it's actually a socioeconomic conflict that started in the 1600s.
That just happens to have a visible religious line. That
divides down. So what if you brought religious studies into Irish schools to talk about the actual difference between Catholic and Protestant? And no, that's not a Catholic and Protestant issue. It's a have and have not issue. And you're mad at the wrong person. You've been mad at the wrong person for 400 years.
Right.
Which and the length of time becomes a problem. And I don't
traditions are important. They become your identity.
But we see the same thing in Israel and Palestine right now. It is absolutely a religious conflict, but
it's way more than that.
Yeah, absolutely. It started with a socioeconomic. We gave away your land, and we shouldn't have.
But now we're so many generations down the line that there's serious, strong feelings on both sides instead of one.
Absolutely. And understanding why it's being funded by the American government is...
Yeah. The Allied forces of the First World War have put an awful lot of energy and money into destabilizing the Middle East. And it's not about religion at all. It's about, we had this empire that we fought in the First World War, and we need to keep them from unifying.
Though there is and I don't know how big it is, I should look it up. There is a group of evangelical Christians that want Israel to come about because they think it'll bring the second coming.
Absolutely.
And that's they are a huge fan. And you can go on I'm going to say you can go on really weird evangelical tours of Israel. That's like, this is where Jesus is going to show up. But yeah, there's like a huge funding of Israel because some people think it's going to bring about the second coming. So again, here's a hugely impactful religious conversation we need to be having because it's hurting a lot of people. And people don't want to have the religious conversation because they're scared they're going to offend someone. And then you can't have the socio and economic conversation or whatever fact, political, economic, all the EOs. Conversation around it because
it's touchy. People's feelings get hurt.
Now I'm riled up.
Right? Anything that fires off that little amygdala in the back of your head makes for a hard conversation. And some people respond very poorly to that thing firing off, and others not so much.
I'm not a great debater. Like, someone will get me angry and I forget everything that I know.
That's frustrating.
Like, I know this is wrong. And that's all my brain goes. That's all it says. And it makes me really mad because everything I have in my arsenal just goes away. And I just get mad.
Your brain's too busy being offended.
No, I get mad because I can't explain why I'm right.
Your brain's too busy being offended.
I guess it is. I'll have to practice.
What else have we got here on our list?
I mean, I want to touch on what I actually think religious studies curriculum look like, but I don't know if there's any other debate points you want to.
No, go for it.
Cool. So I wanted to talk about what I think a comprehensive religious studies curriculum could look like, and jump in if you have any thoughts.
For sure.
Again, this is from a Canadian education perspective, so I apologize for our American listeners. But in Canada, we have a class called Social Studies. You take it grade 1 through 12. And it covers history, economics, politics. Yeah, it covers those things. And do a little bit more every year. And I think the U.S. divides history, but I'm sure they teach social studies.
When I was in high school, we split social studies into geography and history. And then I did both things, and not everybody did.
Yeah, so then we just do different units. Like I said earlier in the episode, one unit is China, and you maybe do that for 2 or 3 months, and then you switch to, you learn about China, and then maybe you learn about capitalism as a concept.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe you learn about World War after that, or our First Nations. And anyway, it's broken down to modules. So I think having religious studies as a piece of social studies is the best way to do it. Just incorporate into the class and teach age-appropriate stuff. And just like you teach China 1 year, maybe 1 year you teach Hinduism. And then you explore some concepts around religion in addition to that.
Yeah, it makes sense. I wouldn't start with Greek mythology and Hellenism with the earliest years, since Zeus is a little rapey. But
we learned about Greece in grade 6. Not about
that's
rapey
age-appropriate.
Zeus, though.
Yeah.
And again, that's something, right? We have to,
age appropriateness.
Things are left out, though.
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
We did China in grade 5 or 6 as well. It's not like we learned.
I bet you didn't cover Taoism at all.
No, we didn't. But we also didn't learn about all the horrible things about China either.
Right.
Or again, and this is a problem, but the big topic in Canada right now is that we didn't learn about residential schools. And maybe you don't teach 6-year-olds about residential schools because it is horrific. But junior high and high school, it should start being introduced as concepts.
Junior high seems like an appropriate age area.
It's just like you don't teach 6 and 7-year-olds about World War II.
Right.
And the genocide of the Jews. But you'd absolutely learn about it in high school, and you absolutely should learn about it in high school. So Same thing. Grade 1, everyone believes different things. Let's talk about Christmas and Hanukkah and Diwali and Eid.
Sure.
And
I like it.
It's fun. And we learn about all the different celebrations that people have.
I like it.
Right? And then in high school, we can talk about, Islamophobia and, tougher, harder topics.
Sounds like a pretty good idea to me.
Right. And then it's not its own class. And I know a lot of parents struggle with the idea of religion being taught in schools or having a course on religion. And so that's why I think it should just be folded into social studies. I also think it should be mandatory. Fight me.
No exemptions. I agree with you completely. The idea that parents pull their kids out of sex ed, for example, these are the kids that need sex ed the most.
And I bring up the mandatory because that is one, especially because, like I said, our new curriculum, not very good curriculum, rollout was supposed to include religious studies. They're talking about revamping it, so I don't know what that looks like. And a lot of parents I saw on Facebook, I don't have kids, but a lot of my parent friends said, I'm okay with that as long as I can exempt my kid, or, it shouldn't be mandatory or whatever. But Preston's exactly right. The people who would pull their kids are the kids who need it the most.
For sure. It's just the idea that somebody would want their kids to not learn a thing sounds obscene to me.
I don't know what they're so scared of. Again, as long as it's religious studies, if it's theological, absolutely. I don't think that should be in schools. But if it is a secular approach to religious studies, I don't understand what you would be concerned about.
Yeah, no, I'm one of those people that was not allowed to be in sex ed. But
it turned out actually okay.
So super weird. I was allowed to be in sex ed in grade 4 when it was in my elementary school.
Because they just talk about pubes in grade 4.
I guess. I don't know. But when it came up again in grade 9 or 10, I think it was grade 9, my mom was like, no, you can't go in there. Anything you want to learn, you can ask me about.
No.
That's wildly inappropriate, one, because you're not going to have the right questions to get any of the information you need from your parents when you're 14 or 15.
There's so much wrong with that.
Also, there's loads of questions that maybe you do have that you are not going to feel comfortable asking your parents at 14 or 15.
Well,
It doesn't matter what kind of relationship you
questions
have.
that, like, your parents might not want to answer those questions.
Right?
Because kids just keep getting freakier. And I can say that as a 30-year-old.
I know for sure that my parents would have answered those questions.
So if you were like, Mom, what's a dirty Sanchez? She'd be like, let me show you. I hope no, I'm kidding. That is not okay. She'd be like, let me tell you. But that's what I mean. Like, there'd be and maybe this is just me as someone who does not want kids, is like, there are things I don't want to tell you from my own comfort level. Not that you shouldn't know them. Well, and I want you to be prepared when someone asks for a dirty Sanchez, but I do not want to be the one to tell you what that is.
From videos that I've seen of what sex ed is in some places, there's an awful lot of material that you shouldn't be learning from your parents. And it's far better in a classroom setting where you're usually safe with anonymity with the anonymous question box thing.
Oh, my
and
friend
in
got
a large
the
group.
Funniest one yesterday.
Yeah, what'd you get?
She put, my friend's a teacher. And obviously she teaches sex ed, and she put one on Instagram, and it said, is it true that girls shed their skin when they get their period? I'm sure it was just a troll, but I laughed so hard.
Kind of. Not really, but kind.
Our exterior skin comes off when we have our period.
Like a lizard.
Yeah, like a lizard. Yes, absolutely. Day 7. I'm surprised your wife hasn't shown you her dead skin. Sorry,
sex ed's important.
Yes. And same thing, right? Like, I think if it started young and age appropriately, like I said, if you get to teach kids that some kids are visited by Santa, and that's really cool, and then some kids get to have this massive feast with their family, and that's really cool, or some kids get to open small presents for 7 nights in a row, and that's really cool. And you're like 6 and you can just be excited for everyone. And then obviously build up to it. Then I don't even think you would need a private question answer period. But if you did, right, like, cool. But we talk, that's 2 things you shouldn't talk about are politics and religion. Well, we still cover politics in school.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes in ineffective ways. Like, honestly, that needs to be revamped. The way I was taught about the Russian Revolution and then the fall of the Soviet Republic or the Soviet Union was honestly pretty disastrous. I've learned a lot better information about that since I've finished high school, that it's not just communism that failed. It was authoritarian dictatorship and corruption that destroyed nations and still is. And everyone's just like, yeah, no, it's communism. Like, it's a lot more complicated than that.
And I understand that the concern about teacher bias.
Yeah,
but same thing,
sure.
It shows up in politics. It shows up in your economics class. Mm-hmm. And if you're a teacher that is so devoutly one religion, that you feel like you can't teach other religions effectively, you probably shouldn't be a teacher, because that's your job, is to disseminate information. But B, then swap with a teacher that can. Right.
You'll find somebody if you look.
Right. To say that it's divisive or it's something that we shouldn't talk about we talk about a lot of things we shouldn't talk about in school, and that's why universities are cesspools of divergent knowledge.
Yeah.
Did you know universities have the weirdest voting pattern? Ridings with universities in them, where students live, have the most divergent voting patterns in the entire province.
I mean, there's
you're more likely to get Rhino Party and Pirate Party and Marijuana Party votes in a university riding than anywhere else.
Of course. There's our former premier runs in a university riding.
She does very well.
And
hippie.
Yeah. It's interesting to see how people who are actively learning behave differently from people who have said, I'm done with education for now.
Right. Maybe as our wrap-up question, how do you think religious studies would change? Or do you have more thoughts that I...
No, go ahead with your question. I'm just scrolling down to see if
make
there's
sure.
anything else that we haven't
How
covered.
do you think religious studies, like learning religious studies in school, would change people's behaviors? And I don't know if you want to talk about that on a student level or familial level or academic level, but...
I'm not sure.
Oh, okay.
It's like learning anything. It can have a variety of effects, I guess. But I think if people are learning more about the people around them, they're going to be a lot less awful to each other. If they can figure out where their prejudices come from or have somebody explain it to them, which is a lot more helpful, then they can evaluate them in a way that makes them a lot easier to shed.
Like your skin after a period.
Yeah, you can find out who the lizard people really are.
That's my skin sloughing noise.
Gross. This world is really complicated. And if we can understand the diversity between us, and even within a single religious tradition, there's diversity. And there's realistically not going to be a lot of time to explore internal diversity in a junior high social studies class, for example. But just introducing that idea can help. Like, you've got people who are so tired of the oppressive Christian religions in a community that it's easy to lose track that not all Christians believe the same things and behave the same way. You've got the Westboro Baptist Church, and then you've got a lot of pretty liberal...
Megan that we posted about the first transgender leader in the Lutheran Church. Right? So everything from a transgender reverend to Westboro Baptist Church.
Which is, of course, our go-to example of a bad Christian church.
Bad.
And there's so much diversity. It's a spectrum.
Take a shot.
And the world is such a cool place that even in groups that you find unfavorable for any reason, there's going to be people in that group that turns out you actually like a lot if you're willing to get past what is sometimes an obvious in-your-face difference. But people suck.
I thought that was going to end really positive, and you ended it with...
So don't be a dick.
Okay, that's fair. I mean, love your neighbor.
I mean, that's ultimately the golden rule. It boils down to that. Love your neighbor. Figure out why your behavior sucks, how it would feel if it were thrown at you, and then stop doing that.
and you know what? I'm going to get curious.
Absolutely.
Get curious, because, I mean, we've covered them all quite broadly, but...
Well, we haven't covered them all. We're working on it.
We've covered the big ones quite broadly. And as an outsider, yeah, sure, they all have some weird beliefs, but they're not that weird in the end, right? No one is so other in these big ones that you couldn't wrap your head around it. Everyone, I mean, they all have their quirks. There's some odd things, but that's what makes them their group.
Yeah. Unless your religion says that you need to find a random stranger and set them on fire in a park, like, you're going to find some overlap in that allows you to be friends with that person.
Absolutely.
If you find a person...
Real common ground.
Yeah. And if you do find a person that likes to light strangers on fire in the park...
Run.
Fix that problem.
Run. Oh, well, I think that was a pretty good one-sided debate.
Yeah, I mean, I wish that we could disagree a little bit more on this, but I mean...
I feel like we're
mostly on the same page
I
here.
hope we covered some of the other outside arguments.
I feel like there are people who disagree with us,
Absolutely.
and we would love to have you join the conversation. We have great discussions from time to time on Discord. If we can make those a little bit more frequent, I am totally game. And we have good times. We share ridiculous memes.
Yes, so we are always continuing. We're always continuing this conversation on our Discord. And if you want us to keep creating more awesome religious studies content, please check out our Patreon or our merch shop and get some bitchin' holy watermelon merch.
Peace be with you.
And salvation for
By the late Middle Ages, the Christian prophecies had fulfilled itself.
God is near.